the core that we build this training upon is the skill of empathy. So it's to know the difference between empathy and other things that a person could be doing, like sympathizing or giving advice or something like that. And to be able to sustain empathic guessing, to be able to stay with another person, not get caught up in your own reactions to whatever they're saying, but be able to stay present with the other person and to have curiosity and inquiry as to what's going on with them in this empathic guessing. So that's what we mean by empathy. Skill number 2 would be a connection request. So I've already referred to this as reflection. That's the one we typically use, which sounds something like, I heard that this person has a need for respect. Are you willing to say that you also heard that they have a need for respect? But also a connection request might sometimes be, so how are you feeling hearing what you just heard? And there would be other variations. 3, we use a phrase from Marshall, pulling by the ears. This is Marshall's metaphor of pulling the jackal by the ears. So it's the skill of supporting a person to reflect without literally pulling anybody by the ears. It's to make it a request, for it to continue to be in a request, but also to be willing to stay with it several iterations, to say, this is why I'm asking. This is to connect the person to your needs, the needs you're trying to meet, and to empathize with whatever's coming up with them at the idea of reflecting the needs they're hearing the other person say. So that's a whole skill set in itself. Number 4 would be emergency first aid empathy, another term we got from Marshall. And you might use that skill also in the pulling by the ears phase. Whenever a person, you're tracking this 4-step initial connection, the 4 steps of the 5-step model. And anytime a person kind of steps out of that model that you're thinking of, you can think of it as giving emergency first aid empathy without the idea that you're going to have it reflected back. So often it happens that you're talking with person A, you're trying to find out, help them clarify what their needs are, what they've said, and what their needs are behind what they've said, so that they can trust they're being heard the way they want to be heard. And the other person reacts to what they're hearing. No, that's not true. That's not you. Well, of course that's what happened. You did it that way. Blah, blah, blah. So when you're saying that, is it because you're feeling distressed? You're wanting to make sure you get heard and that your side, and that you're really trusting that what you say is valued, and whatever it is that connects with them and meets their need. And then a follow-up and say, and I want to hear that if it's true, but generally it is very much true for me. So I'm able to truthfully say, and I want to hear that, and I promise you that I will come back to that. Right now, are you willing for me to complete what I was doing over here with person A? And typically, once a person have their need for empathy met with emergency first aid empathy, they're willing now to go back into this 1, 2, 3, 4, steps 1, 2, 3, 4. So that's the idea of emergency first aid empathy. Number 5 is tracking, and I've just talked about tracking. Of tracking where I am in the process. If someone starts saying, blah, 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 and I do emergency first aid empathy, and then we establish a connection, they're satisfied, they're being heard, their need for empathy is met, that I remember where we were. Because if I can remember and if I can stay with tracking, I can support the creation of trust and a sense of safety in the process. So tracking has that benefit, plus it just helps me move through the world if I have some kind of way to orient how I'm going to facilitate, because I'm acting as a facilitator in this process of supporting a conversation between people that, at least for a period of time, are not able to have the kind of conversation they'd like to have. And as more and more connection arises, I was going to say is created, but it's more like it arises between the parties. As more and more of that connection arises, then I do less and less facilitating, and my tracking, because I still track, but I'm not trying to get people to follow my model so much. Then the sixth skill that we call a skill is interrupting, and this is a skill of how, as a mediator, to interrupt someone when they're using more words than we like, or words that we're concerned are going to stimulate the other person, and that we're wanting to support connection, and so we might interrupt in a situation like that. And typically interruption in the cultures we're raised in is seen as rude. It's assured to generate disconnection. So as young children, our caregivers say, don't interrupt.
That was a little bit fast for me. So we were interrupting was 6, and then was 7 and 8.
Okay. Interrupting is 6. This special interruption by the mediator. Mm-hmm. There's also, and of course you can use these skills in your day-to-day life. If your Aunt Bessie or Geneva calls you up, and or your mother or your whatever, and talks, you can practice interrupting, but interrupting in a way to create connection, to bring you back together, to bring life into the conversation. So these are, we use mediation as the metaphor, but this is really about mediating your life, how to go from the conflicts within your head to conflicts with other people to supporting by lending your skills to people who are in conflict. And the interrupting, when somebody interrupts you, then typically you would use first aid, emergency empathy. Number 7 would be self-empathy, and this is for the mediator, and this is just the skill of being able to bring yourself back to presence using the 4 components in a self-reflective process of what's my observation, what am I feeling, what is my need, and do I have a request? What might my request be in this situation? And typically that's practiced extensively offline so that in the moment you can do your self-empathy and come back to self-connection and presence in a breath or 2 breaths so that you can come back. And if you need a little bit more time, you might take a break and walk to the bathroom and back. But that you can in relatively short periods of time. So we practice a lot offline, taking whatever it takes, 5, 10, 20 minutes for the self-connection, so that you can do it more quickly in the moment. So that's self-empathy. Self-expression is the mediator expressing and saying what's going on with them and ending with a request. So an example is that if people are talking over each other, for instance, I might say, excuse me, it's hard for me to be able to contribute the way I would like because I can't hear what's going on when you're talking at the same time. I wonder if you'd be willing to talk one at a time. And then looking at both of them and seeing if they're willing to agree to that. Most of the time people are. That doesn't mean they won't burst out again and interrupt each other again. But then I can just go back and not try to enforce a rule, but again, just say, excuse me, I'm not able to follow and support you to hear each other if you're both talking at the same time. I wonder if you're willing to talk one at a time. So that's an example of self-expression on behalf of the of the mediator. And then ninth is this solution requests. And solution requests, there's a whole skill around seeing where you are, helping people shape present tense, action language, doable requests. And we've identified 3 categories of requests that we've found. By having these categories in mind, it helps us to track in this process. So there's the main agreement, sort of the agreement that was the purpose of the mediation. But if it's between people who know each other and will continue to have interactions with each other, and their agreement has to do with sort of ongoing ways of interaction, then we think of a supporting agreement or agreements. What could we agree to that would help the main agreement take place, be completed as agreed to? So in a simple example, if two partners, one of them has been not getting home in time to eat with the family, with the spouse and the kids, and now there's an agreement for at least 3 nights a week to be back by 6 p.m. in order to have dinner with the kids and with the spouse. Maybe there's a supporting agreement, at least for the first few times. So maybe that would be a telephone call or a text or something on the calendar, or it's something that they would come up with, not me as the mediator. But having the category of a supporting agreement in mind helps me, again, track and helps me facilitate and helps me support. And then a third category of solution requests would be some kind of remedial agreement. Because particularly when you're trying to change a lifetime of behavior, you can just anticipate that the first few times you try to do something new, it's not going to quite happen the way you want it to happen, and it may not happen at all. So in the example I was giving of the spouse who's now agreed to be home 3 nights a week by 6 p.m., the first time he or she said that they're going to be back, they're not there by 6 o'clock, and they call up, I forgot, la 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 la. And there's this whole thing. Well, you can have an agreement about what you're going to do, anticipating that this might happen. So one of the simple agreements is that you agree to sort of work through and process the reactions to that breach at the next session that you're having with me as an ongoing coaching/mediation process. Or you can agree to, and I've had very detailed, people create between themselves very detailed agreements about what they're going to say to each other. They're going to take breaks. They're going to come back. They're going to remind each other to communicate in a certain way and with a certain kind of awareness to prompt each other. So they have, and they write it out, and they report to me later that it's a big help. So that's an example or 2 examples of remedial agreements.